Hello, welcome to the Elixir of Awareness channel. You're watching episode 32. In this episode, we're talking about the important issue of hidden depression. And our main source is a book titled Perfectly Hidden Depression by Mrs. Margaret Robinson Rutherford, a prominent psychologist who's about 25 years of clinical experience in the field of depression and perfectionism and has done many researches about it. The main idea of this book is about a type of depression that perfectionists often suffer from. We think that perfectionism is a very important topic because it seems to be a common pain among us that's extremely prevalent in today's societies. Billions of people around the world are involved in perfectionism and suffer from this issue. Also, we've an episode in the Elixir of Awareness channel titled Perfectionism there we specifically talked about perfectionism issue. So the link to watch it has been placed for you, and we recommend you to watch it at a suitable time. Mrs. Margaret Robinson believes that there's a hidden relationship between depression and perfectionism. In this book, she goes to people who apparently have no problems and have everything, and they seem very strong and happy at work or in the family. People who are usually the supporter of the other people and don't show any mental weakness, but behind this fake mask of being happy, they experience a deep suffering. And unfortunately, when this suffering becomes unbearable, it becomes very dangerous. In this book, the author talks about people who may commit suicide because of enduring this painful suffering. People who even their closest friends around them don't believe the news of their suicide. Because, as we said, these people don't show any symptoms of depression and look healthy and happy. About the people who were suffering behind the mask of being perfect and the people who've been involved in painful and scary cycles of self-loathing for years without showing it to the surrounding people. While no one has heard the voice of their inner suffering until the situation becomes critical for them. So if you think you're involved in depression caused by perfectionism, or may you know someone close to you in your family, or among your friends with these characteristics who may be involved in hidden depression, we suggest you stay with us until the end of this episode. Because getting information about this important issue can be very helpful.
Don't forget to like and click the subscribe button for more weekly updates on mental health and self-development. Thank you.
The major difference between hidden depression caused by extreme perfectionism and other common types of depression is that it's very difficult to observe and recognize the symptoms of hidden depression in extreme perfectionists. Perfectionists are incredibly good at hiding this depression from everyone, even themselves. If you look carefully at the title of the book, the author has pointed out this issue beautifully. People who are involved in this type of depression experience a permanent gap between what they define for themselves and what's really happening in them. A gap between the feeling that they allow themselves to express and the feeling that they deeply experience from the inside. A gap between outside and inside. A gap between the conscious and the unconscious, which the author believes, this gap is filled with suffering. If you suffer from hidden depression, you won't look like a depressed person from the outside. Depressed people have no energy, and they're sad. For example, maybe a simple brushing is often exhausting for them. Others notice that they're bored or agitated. They sleep a lot or have no appetite. In fact, they send many signs to the surrounding world that show that they need help. But hidden depression is different. It means that you're depressed from the inside, but you're fighting with yourself to not show any help messages in your behavior. And this behavior continues to where sometimes it may be too late because this suffering has been hidden for a long time. This is the reason why when such people do things like suicide, close people of them will surprise. They say, "How is it possible? We saw them just this morning, and they didn't seem to have any problems." It's because when such people reach a serious crisis, they go through the 0 to 100 process much faster than other people with normal depression. But other people with normal depression show symptoms that make both themselves and those around them aware of the problem. While unfortunately this isn't the case for people with hidden depression, and even these people themselves may not know what they're suffering from. Therefore, when an external stimulus affects them in a certain situation, there's no defense mechanism that can calm them down, so they may make the worst decisions at that moment. In fact, they were not prepared for the crisis and never thought they might reach this point. Mrs. Margaret Robinson explains that in these people admitting depression is equivalent to admitting weakness. Therefore, they try as much as possible not to reveal this weakness. Do you see how painful it is?
Don't forget to like and click the subscribe button for more weekly updates on mental health and self-development. Thank you.
But to know if we're suffering from this type of depression or not, Mrs. Margaret Robinson introduces 10 types of common characteristics, which we will discuss briefly. The first characteristic is that your inner voice is constantly scolding. We all have an inner voice that's similar to an inner dialogue. In this inner dialogue, sometimes we praise ourselves and sometimes we blame ourselves, and it can be said that a healthy inner dialogue has a diverse set of emotions within it. But people who suffer from hidden depression, their inner voice is constantly condemning and blaming them. To understand this point, it's better to pay attention to the meaning of the perfectionism concept. This is how Mrs. Brené Brown, the American professor, defines perfectionism. Perfectionism is a self-destructive and addictive thought system, and its core is the belief that if I live perfectly and do things perfectly and look perfect, my brain will leave me away. And then I can get over painful feelings like shame and being judged, and I can stay away from being blamed. This means that the main reason these people try to look perfect is their inner nagging voice. In fact, they think that in order for this voice to be heard less, they need to constantly do excellent and flawless work, but unaware that they're in a destructive, repetitive cycle. And unfortunately, that nagging inner voice that's rooted in childhood will never be quiet. And this internal conversation may become more violent than before. This is one of the most painful mental cycles that exists in all people, but it's stronger in those people who suffer from hidden depression caused by perfectionism. But the second feature of hidden depression is this: you've a strong and excessive sense of responsibility. It means that you're responsible for everything and everyone. Mrs. Margaret Robinson talks about a client named Adam in this book. In the childhood, Adam's father used to torture his children mentally and emotionally because of his alcoholism. For example, he always reminded his children how ungrateful they are, despite his efforts for them. Adam, who was a responsible child, one day takes responsibility for a foul deed that he didn't really do, and because of this, he was severely punished by his father. Mrs. Margaret Robinson realizes during the treatment process of Adam that, unfortunately, he's been carrying a heavy responsibility since his childhood. In fact, Adam has the feeling that everything is his fault throughout his life, and he considers himself responsible for all the events and tries to take responsibility for everything alone in all cases. And as we said, this behavior is one of the causes of hidden depression. Unfortunately, children who have these common experiences think that their value is in exchange for their responsibility. So if you've a child and you behave like this with your child, this can be a serious flip for you, because it's still not too late and you can correct these wrong behaviors. Because right now, the most important source of healing for that child is you, even if they've grown up. So please think about this more seriously. The third characteristic of hidden depression is that you're keeping your mind busy to avoid painful feelings and suppress them. Mrs. Margaret Robinson believes that such people always keep themselves in their personal lives busy to avoid facing these painful emotions. They do this so that they don't hear the voice of that hurt child inside them. And they continue to do this until they aren't even able to recognize those feelings when they encounter with them. But the truth is that sufferings multiply in silence and darkness, and when we ignore them, they become more painful. A sentence that the author mentions many times in this book is that unfamiliar pain is scarier than familiar pain. Because human can recognize, examine, root, and treat familiar pain, but unfamiliar pain can hardly even be felt. One of the clients of Mrs. Dr. Margaret Robinson says, "If my pain is too big for me, I'll make a box for it. And if my pain will be bigger than the box, so I'll definitely make a safe for it, and I'll not let it come out anyway." And unfortunately, this is the method that most people with hidden depression caused by perfectionism use in their lives and build big and bigger safes for their sufferings to keep them up inside their body. But the important question is, why are we afraid of showing some of our feelings? We've already given the answer to this question completely and in detail in the 13th episode of the Elixir of Awareness channel entitled 4 Important Brain Defensive Mechanisms. We recommend you to watch that episode at a suitable time. There, we explained why we fear our feelings and how we suppress them. As we said before, These types of painful feelings can have three common features. They're either painful or complicated or forbidden. In fact, some of our feelings are either painful or forbidden or complicated, so our mental defensive mechanisms suppress them. For example, imagine a mother who's recently had a baby and experiences postpartum depression in the first days after giving birth. It may be due to lack of sleep and disruption in her hormones. And sometimes maybe she gets nervous of her baby, because handling this hard situation, while it's completely normal phenomenon. But because this feeling is very painful, complicated, and also forbidden in public imagination, then the feeling of anger is first suppressed and may even be transferred from the child to his wife. But the more important question is what happens when we suppress an emotion. When we suppress a feeling, the essence of that feeling doesn't disappear, because our feelings don't go away by ignoring them. The point is that just the reasons and origin of that feeling will lose. And that's why this category of emotions usually turns into anxiety in our mind. That is, a painful or complex forbidden feeling that we ignore turns into something vague called anxiety and is placed in the depths of our unconscious. Here we come to the fourth feature of hidden depression. You're always worried, and because you don't know what's the reason for your worry, you try to reduce your anxiety by controlling the environment or the surrounding people. But as we said, the reason for this reaction is the same mechanism of suppressing those complex, painful, or forbidden feelings. The fifth feature of hidden depression is, your sense of worth isn't inherent and depends only on your achievements. It's interesting that you ignore people's compliment. This means that you don't inherently value yourself, and you only value yourself when you achieve something. And this means that your value depends on your achievements, and you can reward yourself only when you've a certain achievement, but even that reward doesn't last long. If someone compliments you, because this compliment is in conflict with your inner image and belief of yourself, you won't accept it. For example, when you achieve an achievement after a lot of effort and share it, and the surrounding people admire it, you suffer from this issue because it puts you in conflict with your inner belief about yourself. Actually, you feel that you aren't worthy enough to be admired by others.
Don't forget to like and click the subscribe button for more weekly updates on mental health and self-development. Thank you.
The sixth feature is that the well-being and comfort of others is very important to you, and you constantly think of others, and you do things for them, but you don't let them enter your inner world. It means that other people's knowledge of you is very superficial, and you don't give them this permission. Seventh feature, you usually consider your hurt and sadness unimportant and insignificant. This means that you hate feeling sorry for yourself. That's why you don't go to your sufferings. The important thing here is to know that self-compassion is different from self-pity. Self-compassion means that we know what's happened to us and know that this past isn't a small thing because it has made your character and it affects your present. But feeling sorry for yourself is different and is usually associated with passivity. Eighth characteristic, you're involved in morbid gratitude. It means that you always think that there are worse people than you and you don't understand the depth of the crisis. Here, the important question is, if you seem happy and cheerful from the outside, how are you doing from the inside? Are you happy and at peace inside? Mrs. Margaret Robinson believes that mental health isn't like a competition with others to say who's healthier and happier or who suffers more or less. But people involved in extreme perfectionism think that if they don't gratitude and pray, the situation may get worse. Definitely, gratitude and pray is a very good and positive thing in life. But its extreme form, which leads us to deny our sufferings, can be destructive. The ninth feature is that we may have side mental health problems. Problems such as obsessive-compulsive disorder, bulimia nervosa, or even anorexia nervosa. Mrs. Margaret Robinson believes that the root of such problems is related to the same inner anxiety that we don't know what its origin is. The 10th characteristic is that you're successful at work, but not in emotional relationships. Because excessive responsibility is usually rewarded in the work environment, but in an emotional relationship, it can disturb the balance of the relationship. You may reach a point where you've to lose your partner in order to reach yourself due to accepting too many responsibilities in the relationship. The author explains that if you've 7 of these 10 characteristics, you're involved in perfectionism, which may lead to hidden depression. If you've more than 10 characteristics, the issue is a bit more serious and you should think about it more seriously. Now, once again, we will review these 10 characteristics very quickly, and you can think about how many of these 10 features you've. 1. Your inner voice is constantly condemning. 2. You've a strong and excessive sense of responsibility. 3. You're keeping your mind constantly busy to avoid painful feelings and suppress them. 4. You're always worried, and because you don't know why, you try to reduce your anxiety by controlling the environment or people around you. 5. Your sense of worth isn't inherent and only conditioned by your achievements. 6. The well-being and comfort of others is very important to you and you do things for them, but you don't allow them to enter your inner world. 7. You consider your injury, sadness, and personal wounds small and insignificant. 8. You've a morbid gratitude. 9. You may have mental health problems such as obsessive disorder or an eating disorder. 10. You're successful at work, but usually not in emotional relationships. Thinking about these characteristics will help you to know how much you may be involved in this perfectionism and how much you need to pay attention to yourself. But we will talk about solutions to heal this suffering. So stay with us.
Don't forget to like and click the subscribe button for more weekly updates on mental health and self-development. Thank you.
As we said, a person with hidden depression doesn't look like a person with common depression, and diagnosing hidden depression is a very complicated task. At Stanford University, where there are more perfectionists, there's a syndrome called Stanford duck syndrome. Some time ago, researchers realized that the mental health situation there has become alarming. For example, they realized that the rate of depression, suicide, and all kinds of mental disorders is increasing, and the overall situation isn't going well. After investigations, they realized that the root of many of these problems is the Stanford duck syndrome. But what's the Stanford duck syndrome? The Stanford duck syndrome is the idea that students are struggling to survive the pressures of a competitive environment while presenting the image of a relaxed student, like a calm duck gliding across a fountain. The truth is that it's an unrealistic expectation to have everything all together all the time. At Stanford University, you've to look like a genius, while not trying to be a genius. Stanford duck syndrome says that a duck in the water is seen as very stable and dignified, but underwater, it spends a lot of effort and energy to keep itself on the surface of the water with legs movements. And Stanford students, like ducks, hid their behind-the-scenes efforts from each other and only tried to display their genius without others realizing that they were working hard to achieve this genius. And this form of perfectionism among Stanford students was the root of those hidden depressions and mental disorders. Of course, after that, researchers tried to consider effective solutions to solve this crisis. A point to remember is that the author of this book has researched this topic for 25 years and has valuable experiences. Especially in the last 10 years, most of her research has been in this field, and he understands the challenges that a perfectionist person faces. And that's why she believes that this treatment process in perfectionist people isn't like a short project, and it's supposed to take a little time and need some patience. The second point that Mrs. Margaret Robinson points out is that if you're involved in this kind of extreme perfectionism, the writing technique can magically help you. But this writing should be purposeful, so Mrs. Margaret Robinson provides you with a series of purposeful questionnaires. For example, one of these questions is, what were your strategies for survival in childhood? The answer to this question is very important. Was it healthy or unhealthy? For example, in your childhood experience, you may have chosen to be happy and laughing always, or someone else may take refuge in imagination. Another child may choose to fight against circumstances lonely, or someone may become invisible from the perspective of people, or by extreme studies show themselves as an acceptable child. The author says to think with yourself how your behavior was as a child, long after perfectionism, and in the next stage, you may have suffered hidden damage. So you may even now use that old childhood strategy and forget that it's all over, and you're older, and you're no longer in that old childhood dream. Another question is, are you still playing your childhood role? What'll happen if you decide not to play that role right now? Is your whole identity dependent on your childhood role? These questions are very important and good questions that you can ask yourself. If the opposite of common clinical depression is vitality, but the opposite of hidden depression is connection with oneself. That is, if common depression is a lack of vitality, hidden depression is a lack of self-acceptance. In common clinical depression, the person's connection with the outside world is very important, but in hidden depression, the person's connection with the outside world isn't a problem, but the person's connection with his inner world is problematic. Self-acceptance is achieved by meeting ourselves. Many of us haven't met ourselves for years and haven't been alone with ourselves. Another technique recommended by Mrs. Margaret Robinson is to write a letter to your inner child. If you've a picture of your childhood, watching it will help you write this letter to yourself. First point is, in this letter, just try to empathize with yourself, that is, with that child, despite all the sufferings, lack of knowledge and weaknesses. And the second point is to try to understand what that child needs to know. For example, if you could travel on time right now and deliver an important message to yourself at the age of 9, what would that message be? The answer to this question can be very helpful. Mrs. Margaret Robinson believes that there are different types of perfectionism. For example, people may be perfectionists about themselves, or some people may be perfectionists towards their surroundings or others. Now, if these two personality types are in relationship, it's more likely that the person who's perfectionist about themselves will be a victim, because they already has the necessary grounds to blame themselves. While the person who's perfectionist about others is also constantly trying to bring the other person closer to their mental standards. If there's no one in your family with whom you can share your suffering and talk to, you can refer to your close friends. Or if you think that someone around you needs to talk and be heard, give them this opportunity so that they can talk to you about their sufferings and mental concerns freely and away from judgment. In this stage, you don't need to do anything special. Just try to be a good listener, that's all. If you're involved in perfectionism and hidden depression, try not to keep silent about it, despite your inner desire. Don't forget sufferings multiply in silence, and the antidote to this is shouting. Mrs. Margaret Robinson believes that you refuse to share what's tormenting you for several reasons. One reason is that you're afraid that the information of your personal life will be revealed, because if this happens, then you'll be mentally vulnerable. Another reason is that you're afraid that others' perception of you'll change and they'll forget that strong and happy face about you. And the third reason is that you're afraid that this will be useless. But know that if you choose the right person, none of these bad things will happen in your mind. Asking for help doesn't mean giving up. It means that you don't want to give up, and this is the height of courage. So ask for help, speak up, and don't be silent. Don't forget that the beginning of freedom way is the inner freedom of humans. And when we look at ourselves, we realize that our emotional freedom has been taken hostage by ourselves. So let's allow ourselves to feel, and don't suppress good or bad feelings. Isn't it captivity if someone can't feel their feelings? You either feel the pain or that pain becomes your whole life. Listen to this sentence from Carl Gustav Jung. What you deny inside becomes your destiny outside. The cost of not communicating with suffering is to live it blindly. So, if you free yourself from this captivity, you'll take the first and most important step. Accepting your suffering is the key to your liberation. And understanding captivity is the beginning of life. This episode ends here, and we hope that what we've said will help you. If you're also involved in hidden depression caused by extreme perfectionism, be able to start the path of your treatment by understanding the problem. And on the other hand, if someone close to you who is important to you is involved in this matter, you can help them or even save their life before it's too late. The final question of this episode is, do you also think you experienced hidden depression caused by perfectionism? Please share your comments with us. Thank you very much for being with us until the end.
Don't forget to like and click the subscribe button for more weekly updates on mental health and self-development. Thank you.